The Zavari royal palace stretched endlessly before Xander, its emerald and gold architecture reaching toward a ceiling that seemed to hold captured stars. Each surface gleamed with an inner light that pulsed like a heartbeat, casting dancing shadows across pillars that twisted skyward like frozen flame. The air itself shimmered with an otherworldly quality, thick with the scent of exotic flowers, and something Xander couldn't identify, something that spoke of power and ancient secrets. His blood-soaked diplomatic uniform clung to his skin, a stark reminder of the 3 days he'd spent in the detention chambers below. 3 days without food, with only enough water to keep him conscious for what they called the questioning. His throat burned with thirst and every muscle in his body ached from the cramped confines of his cell, but he forced himself to stand straight as the guards flanked him on either side. The throne room doors, massive slabs of what looked like crystallized moonlight, began to part with a sound like distant thunder. Beyond them, Queen Valina waited on a throne that defied physics, floating several feet above the ground, and surrounded by a constellation of smaller crystals that orbited slowly around her like miniature planets. Xander had seen images of the Zavari queen during his diplomatic training, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of her presence. Her skin held the luminescent quality of jade, seeming to glow from within with a soft green light. Her eyes were the deep purple of twilight, ancient and knowing, filled with an intelligence that made Xander feel like a child seeing the ocean for the first time. Her attire flowed around her like liquid silver, constantly shifting and rippling, as though alive, occasionally revealing glimpses of intricate tattoos that traced patterns across her arms and throat, markings that spoke of lineage power and ceremonies older than human civilization. The peace accords that had been carefully negotiated over decades lay in ruins now. The delegation from Earth had been accused of constructing secret weapons in the neutral zone, a violation so severe it threatened to ignite war across 3 star systems. Xander knew the charges were fabricated, but proving it from a Zavari prison cell seemed impossible. Xander of Earth. Queen Valina's voice carried the musical quality of wind chimes, mixed with the authority of thunderstorms. You stand accused of violating the Harmony Covenant. Your species promised peace, yet our sensors detected weapons construction in the Meridian sector. With respect, Your Majesty. Xander's voice came out hoarser than he'd intended, but he pushed forward. Those sensor readings are false. Earth has honored every term of the Covenant. We've dismantled our military stations and opened our borders to Zavari inspection teams. Valina's purple eyes narrowed slightly. You speak of honor while standing in chains, Ambassador. Your words carry the weight of your actions. Then let my actions speak for themselves, Xander replied, meeting her gaze despite the protocol that demanded he look away. I volunteered for this mission knowing the risks. I came here to prevent war, not to wage it. A murmur rippled through the assembled court. Zavari nobles in their flowing garments, their skin various shades of blue and green, their eyes glowing with inner light. Some looked offended by his boldness. Others seemed intrigued. The sovereign's crown will determine the truth, Valina announced, rising from her throne with fluid grace. It has been the arbiter of justice for our people for over 1,000 years. 2 guards brought forth a pedestal, and upon it rested what could only be the legendary crown. It was unlike anything Xander had ever seen. Not a crown in the traditional sense, but rather a complex crystalline structure that seemed to exist partially in this dimension and partially in another. Light bent around it in impossible ways, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly, as though the crown existed in more than the standard 3 dimensions. The crown reads the intentions of all who wear it, Valina explained, her voice carrying throughout the vast chamber, without any need for amplification. It reveals truth and deception with equal clarity. No Zavari has been able to deceive it in all our recorded history. And has a human ever worn it? Xander asked. No, came a voice from the assembled council. Counselor Zoran stepped forward, his deep blue skin marked with the silver patterns that indicated his high rank among the conservatives. Nor should one. The crown chooses only those with Zavari blood. It has rejected every attempt by outsiders to wear it. Another counselor, this one with lighter green skin and golden markings, moved to Zoran's side. "Perhaps it is time to test those old assumptions, Counselor Zoran," Thalia said, her voice carrying the authority of the progressive faction. "If we are to judge this human's words, should we not use the most accurate method available?" The debate that erupted in the council chamber was unlike anything Xander had witnessed in Earth's diplomatic halls. The Zavari argued with their entire beings, their skin changing hues to reflect their emotional states, their voices weaving together in harmonies and discordances that created almost musical arguments. Some sang their points, others spoke in rhythms that felt like poetry, and still others projected emotions so strongly that Xander could feel echoes of their passion even from his position in the center of the room. Queen Valina raised one hand and silence fell like a curtain dropped on a stage. "The decision is mine," she declared. "The human will wear the crown." The crown was brought forward by two priests in robes that seemed to be made of captured starlight. As they lifted it toward Xander's head, he felt a strange tingling sensation, as though the air itself was charged with electricity. The moment the crown touched his temples, the sensation exploded into something far more intense. Light erupted from the crown, not the soft internal glow it had possessed before, but blazing brilliance that illuminated every corner of the throne room. The assembled Zavari gasped, some falling to their knees, others backing away in apparent fear or awe. The light pulsed with a rhythm that matched Xander's heartbeat, growing brighter with each beat, until it seemed the crown had become a miniature star. Xander felt a presence in his mind, ancient, vast, and utterly alien, yet somehow familiar. It sifted through his memories, his intentions, his deepest fears, and highest hopes. He saw flashes of things that weren't his memories, glimpses of Zavari history, the construction of the first stargates, the long war with the Void Dwellers that had ended only by nearly destroying both civilizations. He saw the crown's creation, forged not by Zavari hands alone, but by something else. Something older. The light began to fade, but it didn't disappear entirely. Instead, it settled into a steady glow that emanated from the crown, creating an aurora effect around Xander's head. When he looked out at the assembled court, he saw expressions ranging from shock to terror to something that might have been hope. "Impossible," Zoran whispered, his skin, now a pale, almost transparent blue. "The crown has never... No outsider has ever..." "The crown has chosen," Valina said, her voice barely above a whisper. "After 900 years of rejecting every successor I've presented to it, the sovereign's crown has chosen a human." The implications hit the chamber like a physical force. If the crown recognized Xander as worthy, not just of truth-telling but of leadership, it challenged every assumption the Zavari had about their own society, their relationship with other species, and their future as a civilization. This changes nothing. Malik stepped forward from the shadows behind the throne. Xander hadn't noticed him before. The advisor seemed to have a talent for remaining unseen until he chose otherwise. His skin was a deeper green than Valina's, almost black in its intensity, and his eyes held no warmth whatsoever. "The crown may glow, but tradition is clear. Only those of pure Zavari blood may rule." "The crown's judgment supersedes tradition," Thalia argued. "It always has." "For Zavari," Zoran interjected. "This human may be truthful, but that doesn't make him one of us." The argument might have continued indefinitely, but Valina raised her hand again. "Enough. Captain Krav, escort the human to the diplomatic quarters in the upper palace. He is no longer a prisoner, but a guest whose status requires careful consideration." Captain Krav, a Zavari, whose skin bore scars that gleamed with an internal light of their own, stepped forward. "Your Majesty." As Xander was led away, He caught sight of Valina watching him. For just a moment her composed expression slipped, and he saw uncertainty there, and perhaps something that looked like curiosity. The diplomatic quarters were a vast improvement over his cell. The rooms were spacious, with walls that seemed to be carved from single pieces of luminescent stone. Furniture grew from the floor itself, shaped from the same living crystal that formed the palace walls. Through an archway he could see a private garden where flowers that looked like they were made of living flame swayed in a breeze that carried the scent of ozone and distant rain. Over the following days, Xander found himself in a strange position. He was free to move throughout much of the palace, accompanied always by guards who seemed as puzzled by his situation as he was. Some Zavari he encountered treated him with suspicion, others with curiosity, and a few with what seemed like reverence. He spent hours in the palace archives, learning about Zavari culture and history with the help of translation programs that worked directly with his neural implants. He discovered that the Zavari had once been explorers and traders, but centuries of conflict with hostile alien species had made them increasingly insular. The Crown's choosing of him suggested a destiny they weren't prepared for. It was during one of these research sessions that he met Dr. Everin, the palace's chief geneticist. She was smaller than most Zavari, with skin that shifted between green and blue, like deep water, and eyes that held the intensity of a scientist who had stumbled upon something extraordinary. "Your results," she said, without preamble, setting down a crystal tablet that projected holographic data. "They're unprecedented." "In what way?" Xander asked, studying the swirling genetic maps that meant nothing to him. "You're not entirely human," Dr. Everin said bluntly. "Approximately 12% of your genetic code comes from another source, ancient markers that we previously thought were extinct." She manipulated the hologram, highlighting specific sequences. "These genetic signatures match samples we have from the first era of Zavari expansion. Before we became a single unified species, we encountered and occasionally integrated with other spacefaring races. One of those races was a precursor species that possessed remarkable adaptability and psychic potential." "You're saying I'm part alien?" "I'm saying you're part of what the Zavari once were before we purified our bloodlines in the name of genetic stability. The Crown recognizes this heritage. It was programmed to respond not just to Zavari DNA, but to the potential for harmony between species, a trait that has been bred out of us for millennia." Xander stared at the genetic map, trying to process the implications. "Does Queen Valina know about this?" "I've already sent the report," Dr. Everin replied. "She requested a full analysis the day the Crown chose you." That evening, Xander was summoned to Valina's private chambers, not the throne room, but a more intimate space high in one of the palace spires. The room was dominated by a wall of transparent crystal that offered a view of the binary sunset painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Valina stood silhouetted against the window, still wearing her flowing silver garments, but with the formal crown replaced by a simpler circlet that seemed to be made of crystallized starlight. When she turned to face him, Xander saw that her expression was unreadable. "Dr. Everin's findings change everything," she said, without preamble. "If her analysis is correct, you carry the genetic legacy of the unifiers, the ancient ones who first brought the scattered Zavari clans together." "What does that mean for me, for my people?" Valina moved to a low table where 2 cups waited, filled with a luminescent liquid that gave off a faint floral aroma. "Traditional Zavari greeting ceremony," she explained, offering him 1 cup. "We drink together to establish trust." Xander accepted the cup, noting how the liquid seemed to swirl with its own internal light. "Is it safe for humans?" "Dr. Everin assures me it will only enhance the psychic resonance you apparently possess," Valina replied, raising her own cup. "To understanding between peoples." They drank simultaneously. The liquid tasted like honey and starlight, if such a combination were possible, and Xander felt a warm, tingling sensation spread through his body. More than that, he became aware of Valina's presence in a way that transcended the physical. He could sense her emotions like colors at the edge of his vision. Now you understand how we truly communicate, Valina said, and Xander realized he hadn't seen her lips move. Her voice came from within his mind, but it felt natural, rather than invasive. The crown chosen you because you can bridge our peoples in ways we never imagined possible. What you're suggesting, Xander spoke aloud, finding that his mental voice felt rusty in comparison. It would require changes that neither of our cultures may be ready for. Perhaps. But the alternative is stagnation for the Zavari and probable war with Earth. The accusations against your people, they weren't entirely fabricated. Xander felt a chill of fear from Valina's mind. What do you mean? There are factions among my people who believe war is inevitable. They've been encouraging conflicts, creating evidence to support their theories. The weapon signatures your delegation was accused of creating. They were Zavari weapons placed in the neutral zone by our own military extremists. The revelation hit Xander like a physical blow. You knew your people were framing Earth for war crimes. I suspected. But I had no proof, and the Council would never have accepted accusations without evidence. That's why I needed the Crown's judgment. Not just of your honesty, but of your potential as an ally. Over the following weeks, Xander found himself drawn deeper into Zavari society and politics. He learned their customs, participated in their festivals, and even began to form genuine friendships with progressive Zavari nobles, like Thalia. But it was his growing relationship with Valina that proved most significant. They spent hours together, walking in the eternal gardens where bioluminescent plants created patterns of light that responded to their mood, discussing philosophy and species relations, while sharing meals of foods that challenged every assumption Xander had about flavor and nutrition. She taught him the Zavari art of light dancing, a form of communication that combined movement with the manipulation of personal bioluminescence to create complex emotional narratives. One evening, as they walked through a section of the garden where the plants grew in perfect geometric spirals, Valina spoke about the loneliness of leadership. The Crown has rejected 47 potential successors. She said, her skin reflecting a deep blue that Xander had learned to recognize as melancholy. Princesses, general scholars, some of the finest Zavari of their generation. I began to believe that I would be the last queen, that our monarchy would die with me. And now I wonder if perhaps the Crown was waiting for something unprecedented. Someone who could do what none of us could. Unite the progressive and conservative factions under a new vision of what the Zavari could become. They paused beside a fountain where water seemed to flow upward, creating impossible spirals that caught and reflected the garden's lights. Xander found himself studying Valina's profile, noting how the fountain's glow brought out the patterns in her skin he'd never noticed before. Valina, he said carefully, what exactly are you asking of me? She turned to face him, and in her expression he saw vulnerability he hadn't expected from a queen. I'm asking if you would consider a role that has never existed before. Not as a successor to my throne, but as a co-ruler. A bridge between our peoples that could forge an alliance strong enough to bring peace to both our systems. A partnership. A partnership, she confirmed. Though I should warn you, there are those who would see such an arrangement as the ultimate betrayal of Zavari purity. Malik, for one, becomes more hostile to your presence each day. As if summoned by his name, a commotion arose from the direction of the palace. Captain Krav appeared running with urgent speed, despite the dignity usually required in the royal gardens. Your Majesty, he called out, his skin flashing red with alarm patterns. Councillor Malik has sealed the council chambers. He's declaring an emergency session to address the human contamination of the royal line. Valina's expression hardened, her skin shifting to the deep purple that indicated royal rage. He dares to call an emergency session without my authorization. More than that, Your Majesty. He's claiming that your association with the human has rendered you unfit to rule. He's calling for the council to formally remove you from the throne. Xander felt the situation spiraling beyond anything he'd prepared for. Valina, I should remove myself from this equation. Let you deal with your political situation without the complication of— No. Her reply was swift and final. If we retreat now, Malik will see it as validation of his position. The Crown chose you, Xander. That choice means something whether the Conservative Council wants to acknowledge it or not. They made their way back to the palace with urgent speed, but even from a distance it was clear that something was seriously wrong. Guards who normally bowed respectfully to Valina instead blocked their path, their expressions apologetic but determined. By order of the Emergency Council, you are to remain in your quarters pending review of the succession question, the guard captain informed them. Captain Krav, Valina said calmly, arrest these guards for treason. Krav stepped forward, but more guards emerged from alcoves and corridors. They were outnumbered 3-1. I'm sorry, Your Majesty, Krav said, his skin showing deep regret patterns. Malik has convinced enough of the military commanders that your judgment is compromised. They were escorted not to Valina's quarters, but to a secure wing of the palace that Xander had never seen before. The cells there were lavish compared to where he'd first been held, but they were cells nonetheless. As the crystalline barriers sealed them in, Valina turned to Xander with determination in her eyes. Malik has overplayed his hand, she said. The emergency provisions allow for the removal of a queen, but only if the Crown accepts a new candidate. And the Crown has already shown what it thinks of traditional succession. What do you mean? I mean that in Zavari law, a queen can designate a co-ruler in times of extreme crisis, and that co-ruler gains the right to the succession trial. It's an ancient provision created during the war with the Void Dwellers, when queens regularly died in battle and didn't have time for formal succession rituals. Xander began to understand. You're going to name me co-ruler. I'm going to do more than that. I'm going to invoke the rite of binding, a ceremony that links two rulers so completely that one cannot be removed without the other. It hasn't been used in over 600 years, but the legal precedent is clear. Over the next several hours, while Malik consolidated his coup in the council chambers, Valina and Xander planned their response. Krav, despite his apparent compliance with the new regime, proved to be playing a deeper game. During a supposed routine check on the prisoners, he passed them information about Malik's support structure, and more importantly, smuggled in the components Valina needed for the binding ceremony. The ceremony itself was unlike anything in Xander's experience. Using a small portable crystal array, Valina began what was part legal, preceding part religious ritual, and part something that transcended both. As she spoke, the ancient words in Old Zavari, the crystals began to resonate, creating harmonics that seemed to reach beyond sound into pure intention. Xander felt the change the moment the final word was spoken. It was as though a door had opened in his mind, and through it flowed not just Valina's thoughts and emotions, but her entire experience of what it meant to be Zavari. He saw through her eyes the weight of centuries of tradition, the loneliness of absolute authority, and the hope she'd felt when the Crown chose him. In return, she experienced his memories of Earth, his commitment to peace, and his growing love for both her and her people. It's done, she said, but Xander could hear the words both with his ears and directly in his mind. You are now bound to the Crown as much as I am. Malik cannot remove one of us without removing both. Will that stop him? Before Valina could answer, alarms began sounding throughout the palace. Through their cell's transparent wall, they could see guards running their bioluminescent skin, flashing urgent signals. Captain Krav appeared again, this time without pretense. Your Majesties, he said, Malik has declared himself Regent Guardian and announced that both of you will be executed at dawn for treason against racial purity. The conservative faction has seized control of all major palace systems. Then we end this tonight, Valina declared. Krav, how many guards remain loyal? Perhaps 40% of the palace guard and nearly all of the Royal Archives Division. Councillor Thalia has allied with us and controls the communication systems in the outer districts. And the Crown, under heavy guard in the ceremonial chamber. Malik plans to destroy it if he cannot force it to choose him. Valina and Xander exchanged glances. The crown's destruction would be catastrophic, not just politically but spiritually. It was the symbol of everything the Zavari aspired to be. "We stop him," Xander said. "Whatever it takes." The escape from their cells was almost anticlimactic. Krav had been systematically replacing the guards with loyalists, and those who remained true to Malik were overwhelmed before they could raise an alarm. Moving through the palace's service tunnels, ancient passages that existed behind the living crystal walls, they made their way toward the ceremonial chamber. The route took them through sections of the palace Xander had never seen. Here, the walls were older, covered in carvings that seemed to move in the peripheral vision. Valina explained that these were records of the first binding, the original ceremony that had united the Zavari clans under a single crown thousands of years ago. "The crown isn't just a symbol," she said, as they paused at an intersection of tunnels. "It's a repository of genetic memory, a direct link to every Zavari ruler who came before. When it chose you, it wasn't just accepting your potential leadership. It was adding your genetic signature to the chain of memory that defines our people." They emerged from the tunnels into a maintenance area near the ceremonial chamber. Through crystal walls, they could see the sacred space where the crown rested on its ancient pedestal. Malik stood before it, surrounded by a dozen conservative counselors and twice as many guards. He was speaking his words unclear through the barrier, but his gestures were unmistakable. He was trying to force the crown to accept him. As they watched, he lifted the crown toward his head. The moment it touched his temples, a pulse of dark energy erupted outward. Malik screamed and staggered, the crown falling to the floor with a sound like breaking crystal. When he looked up, his skin had turned an ashen gray, and his eyes held the vacant look of someone who had touched something far beyond their comprehension. "The crown rejected him," Valina whispered, violently. "Is he alive?" But the crown's rejection leaves marks on the mind. He'll never be the same. Despite the crown's rejection of Malik, the conservative faction showed no signs of backing down. If anything, seeing their leader's failure only seemed to make them more desperate. Zoran stepped forward, picking up the crown despite Malik's condition. "If none of pure blood can be chosen," Zoran declared, his voice carrying through the chamber, "then the crown has been corrupted. It must be cleansed or destroyed." "We have to stop them now," Xander said. The assault on the ceremonial chamber was not a battle in any traditional sense. The loyal guards led by Krav created diversions, while Xander and Valina approached through a maintenance shaft that opened directly above the crown's pedestal. The plan was simple: get the crown to safety before the conservatives could destroy it. But as Xander lowered himself through the shaft, he realized the crown seemed to be calling to him. The closer he got, the brighter its inner light became, until the entire chamber was illuminated with the same aurora effect he'd experienced during his first encounter with it. He dropped to the floor, just as Zoran raised a ceremonial weapon above the crown. "Stop!" Xander shouted, and his voice carried a harmonics that froze everyone in the chamber. "The outsider dares command us in sacred space," Zoran snarled, but Xander could see fear in his eyes. "I command nothing," Xander replied, moving toward the crown. "But I will not let you destroy something sacred out of fear." He reached the pedestal, just as Zoran brought the weapon down. Instead of dodging, Xander caught the blade with his bare hands. The weapon, designed to shatter crystalline structures, met the crown's field and dissolved into component atoms. Xander lifted the crown, and as he placed it on his head, the chamber exploded with light once again. But this time, the light wasn't just emanating from the crown. It was coming from Xander himself, as every trace of the ancient genetic heritage in his DNA responded to the crown's call. In that moment, every Zavari in the chamber experienced something unprecedented. Through the crown's field, they felt Xander's memories, his experiences, his genuine desire for peace and cooperation between their peoples. They felt Valina's love for her people and her willingness to sacrifice tradition for a better future. And they felt something else, a glimpse of what the Zavari could become if they opened themselves to the galaxy once again. When the light faded, Counselor Zorn was on his knees, his skin cycles through rapid color changes that indicated profound confusion and awe. Malik, though, still damaged by his contact with the crown, was staring at Xander with something that might have been understanding rather than hatred. "The crown has spoken," Valina declared, entering the chamber with the loyal guards. "Not just for tonight, but for our future. It chose a hybrid, someone who carries the best of what we were and the promise of what we could become." Over the following days, the political situation stabilized with surprising speed. The Crown's public demonstration of its choice, combined with Dr. Everin's genetic analysis, convinced all but the most extreme conservatives that Xander's acceptance was legitimate. Malik, permanently changed by his violent rejection from the Crown, became an unexpected ally, using his influence to help transition the government toward the new paradigm. Councillor Thalia formally proposed legislation to establish Earth-Zavari joint colonies, beginning with the worlds that had been abandoned during the years of isolationism. The motion passed with a greater majority than anyone had expected. Xander found himself with a new title, Crown Consort and Ambassador Eternal, and responsibilities that stretched far beyond anything he'd been trained for as a diplomat. Together with Valina, he worked to establish the legal framework for a new kind of civilization, one that embraced diversity rather than fearing it. The first joint colony ship launched 6 months later, carrying both humans and Zavari to a world on the edge of known space. The crew was commanded by Captain Krav, who had requested the assignment specifically because he wanted to be part of history rather than just guarding it. Dr. Everin established a new research initiative studying the genetic compatibility of humans and Zavari, and working to understand how the ancient hybrid heritage might be reintroduced to both species safely and consensually. Her work suggested that the barriers between the peoples were far more artificial than anyone had suspected. As for Xander and Valina, they ruled together in a way that had never been tried before. The crown, once a symbol of isolation and rigid tradition, became something new, a bridge between worlds, a symbol of cooperation rather than domination. They often walked together in the eternal gardens where new plants had been introduced from Earth, creating hybrid ecosystems that were somehow more beautiful than either parent biosphere alone. The crown, when either of them wore it, had settled into a steady glow that seemed to pulse with contentment rather than the urgent fire of change. One evening, as they watched the binary sunset paint the sky in impossible colors, Valina reflected on how much had changed. "When I was young," she said, her fingers intertwined with Xander's, "my tutors taught me that the crown was the ultimate symbol of Zavari supremacy, that it chose only the purest bloodlines because we were destined to rule alone. And now I think the crown was lonely. For 1,000 years it's been trying to tell us that purity isn't strength, that the future belongs to those who can bring different strengths together." Above them, the first stars were appearing, including several that now hosted joint human-Zavari settlements. Ships traveled between the worlds regularly, carrying not just goods and resources, but ideas, art, and the growing number of children who would grow up considering both species as family. "Do you ever miss Earth?" Valina asked. Xander considered the question. "I miss some things about it, but Earth exists in me just as Zavari exists in you. We carry our heritage wherever we go, and now we're creating something new that honors both." The crown pulsed gently, and for a moment both of them felt the presence of every ruler who had come before, stretching back through millennia. But alongside the ancient memories, they felt something else. Potential futures, possibilities that would only exist because they had chosen to bridge the gap between their peoples. "The beginning rather than the end," Valina murmured. "Of everything," Xander agreed. As the larger of the two suns disappeared behind the palace's crystal spires, the gardens around them began their nightly transformation. Bioluminescent flowers opened, releasing spores that created brief constellations in the air before drifting away on the warm breeze. Somewhere in the distance, music began, a blend of human and Zavari instruments, creating harmonies that neither species could have achieved alone. The crown had chosen well. It had rejected successors for centuries, not because they weren't worthy, but because the time wasn't right. It had waited for the moment when the Zavari would be ready to define themselves, not by what they excluded, but by what they could embrace. In the years that followed, historians would mark this as the beginning of the true age, when two civilizations became one, not through conquest or absorption, but through synthesis. The crown's glow became the symbol of this new era, a reminder that sometimes the most profound strength comes from accepting what seems impossible, and that wisdom often means recognizing when it's time to become something greater than what you were. And in the eternal gardens of the Zavari Palace, where flowers from two worlds created beauty that surpassed either alone, two rulers continued their evening walks, planning for a future that would honor both their heritages while creating something entirely new. The crown, when either wore it, continued to glow with quiet satisfaction, its long wait finally over its purpose, finally fulfilled.